Hello and welcome to the Australia Institute's Policy School. My name's Alice Grundy and I'm a research manager here at the Australia Institute. I'm coming to you today from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I would like to pay my respects to the caretakers of this land who've been looking after it for many, many millennia. We're starting a new year of Policy School and we're getting off to a great start with the director of the Australia Institute's Democracy and Accountability, and I've managed to forget what you do, Bill, the program at the Australia Institute for Democracy and Accountability. And he's going to be talking about some of the key issues and the current policy landscape, what the evidence-based research shows, barriers to reforming policy, the most persuasive arguments and key messages, and how to communicate cut-through facts and data to help you change minds. At the end of Policy School, you'll be able to confidently advocate for what needs to be done, explain why it needs to be done, and how we can all work together to achieve a more just and equitable society. So a few reminders: you can type in a question for Bill using the Q&A box, and you can upvote other people's questions as well. We'll get to those at the end. You can put your questions in at any time. You don't have to wait until the end. And if there's a term you'd like more detail on or something you're curious about, just put your question in. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And finally, this is a live event and it is being recorded. The video will be available afterwards on our website, australiainstitute.org.au. So Bill Browne is going to be talking to us about electoral funding today, where the money comes from and what are the proposed changes that are coming up before Parliament. Bill's diverse areas of interest include the use of opinion polling, forecasting to predict policy outcomes, truth in political advertising reforms, digital technology, and the role of the states and the Senate in Australian democracy. Prior to coming to the Australia Institute, he worked as an environmental social governance analyst. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks a lot, Alice, and thank you everyone for joining us. I specifically requested this first policy school of the year because political finance is going to matter, not just at the federal election, which we have coming up perhaps in a few months, but also in the very next fortnight. Parliament's returning and is going to be considering major changes to how political finance works in Australia. When we say political finance, we're talking very generally about how we fund our politics, the money that goes to political parties, candidates and campaigners, where it comes from, how substantial it is, and where that money goes, how the people who receive that money spend it. This is of interest not just because of the election that's coming up, but also because all of you are political funders as well. Anyone who casts a vote in an Australian election is deciding how money is distributed based on the candidates that you vote for. You're also a consumer of political finance in the sense that it funds political advertising that you are probably already seeing for an election that hasn't even been called yet. But as well as the upcoming federal election, maybe 100 days away or less, more immediately, the Albanese government is planning to introduce new laws that make dramatic changes to how political parties and candidates are funded in Australia. And they've done so at a breakneck speed. So part of my objective of this policy school is to take a step back, look at some of the numbers involved in Australian political finance, take you through some of the top level changes that are being proposed, and arm you with the ability to think critically about what you want to see from a political system that is funded in large part by you, and that you are a consumer of the advertising of, but also as a voter, someone who's entitled to have an opinion on how this system all works. So I'll share my slides here. And my plan here is to take you through first an overview of the kind of numbers involved, who's getting the money, where it comes from, and so on. then to ask, what would fair reform to this system look like? How, when I'm assessing a proposal to change this system, what am I weighing up in deciding if I think it's a good or a bad idea? I'll then take you through the status quo of how electoral and political finance law works in Australia at the moment and what the Albanese government is proposing to change. And then I'll suggest a few constructive reforms that I think would be a good avenue to pursue to clean up the political system. So to give you a rough overview of the kinds of sums of money involved, these are the disclosures about the receipts of money, the money that's gone in to the four established parties, Liberal, Labor, Greens, and Nationals. Rather than the specifics, I'm more interested here in the general picture, which is that each of the two major parties receives about $100 million per year. The Greens are about $20 million a year. The Nationals maybe around $15 million a year. It's worth noting first the significant the way that this data is very general. It includes spending on state elections as well as federal elections, and it includes non-election expenses. If we think about running a political party, you need to provide services to members, hold conferences, develop policy, hire staff, pay for fundraising, hire legal teams or pay for external legal advice. So these sums of money are not exclusively going to winning your votes, at least not directly. Now, that's the sums of money involved, but the next question is where they're actually coming from. And I think our archetypical idea of party funding or candidate funding is that it's from donations. And already we can see there's great variety. It can be a donation from a member of the public. It can be a bequest. It can come from a corporation or a lobby group, from a wealthy individual, a trade union. It can be from a donation aggregator. So that's where you might donate to an entity that then passes on those donations to the candidates or parties that they think are most viable or most match their values. It can be a donation from a candidate. They know that it takes money and investment to get elected, and they're willing to make a personal contribution. And it can come from members of parliament and their staff. But donations, which broadly we can understand as money that's given without something in return, or at least without anything explicit in return, there are other sources of funding. There's cash for access payments. So this is where you might pay $2,000 to have dinner with a minister, which gives you a privileged opportunity to put your case to them about how Australia should change. There's also party membership fees, and there we're talking both about payments from the rank and file. Maybe it's $100 per year to join a political party, but then also the business forums that political parties run, where businesses can pay in the thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, and often that's linked to opening up cash for access opportunities. Union affiliation fees, particularly for the Labor Party. There's also the tithe on MPs and staff. This is more or less strictly enforced by different political parties. But in general, what it means is that a member of parliament is expected to contribute part of their salary back to the party that helped them get elected. And in some cases, that tithe is also imposed on the staff members for that member of parliament. So they're contributing back to the party, but it's not really a donation if it's an obligation as part of being a representative of that party. And then there's assets and investments. So some parties have operated for decades or over 100 years. They've accumulated a variety of different shareholdings, property investments, and different kind of vehicles of that nature. And the dividends and so on that come in can also go to the party's receipts, the money that the party is earning. So when we actually look at a breakdown of where the different monies in our political system comes from, you can see that it's quite a varied picture. And I think of it as roughly breaking down into 3/3. Public funding is responsible for about 1/3 of the money going into our political system. This is the money that's distributed when you cast your vote for a particular candidate. It works out to about $3 per vote. And of course, in our federal elections, we vote twice, once for the House of Representatives, once for the Senate. So that works out to about $6 per voter. There's also undisclosed private income, what's sometimes called dark money. So parties and candidates are only required to disclose money that comes in that's above about $17,000. So they're receiving large sums of money in aggregate, but each of those individual transactions is beneath the disclosure threshold. It shows up in this undisclosed private income column. Then when it comes to the money that's actually disclosed, so these are the substantial receipts of $17,000 or more, again, donations actually only represents a fraction of this total. It's the other receipts, whether it's affiliation fees, tithes, cash for access payments, or so on, that represent the larger share of this disclosed sum of money. The big asterisk over all of this is that I've actually carved out a major source of political donations and treated it completely separately from the rest. And that's donations from mineralogy, which is Clive Palmer's outfit. These are donations going to the United Australia Party, as the most recent party that he's founded. And as you can see here, they are of a scale that is unlike any other large donation. And if you think back to the annual earnings of political parties, you can see that this one minor party, thanks to Clive Palmer, is funded at a scale we'd normally expect from a major party. But I carved them out because I wanted people to realize that the picture for other political parties is very different. For those parties, donations, and particularly disclosed donations, are only a relatively small portion of their earnings. So I started here because I wanted to, I think if we're going to regulate this area, we need to understand it. And having seen some of those figures, I think there's already some observations that stand out about how we might approach the issue of regulating how political parties and candidates are funded. The first is that I think we can see here already an explanation for why the major parties might be happy to entertain limits on political donations, restrictions on how large political donations can be. Because for the major parties, at least, they have many varied sources of political funding, many of which are not covered by a donation cap, by a restriction on the size that a single donor can give to a single recipient. That's illuminating, I think. And we see at the state level that some of the things that don't count as political donations, like the tithe that's charged on MPs and staff, or like the earnings from asset investments, can be worth more to the political parties than donations are. That's quite distinct from new entrants to the political system who don't have the benefit of public funding, who haven't accumulated assets, who may not have any sitting members of parliament that can pay a tithe, who are much more dependent on political donations and therefore much more exposed to a cap on political donations. I think another observation is we see here immediately the disruption to the status quo that Clive Palmer represents. The United Australia Party, in terms of the votes it receives, is a minor party, but it spends money as if it were a major party. And it makes that money in a way that's unlike how other parties of that scale make their money. I think also we see here the total scale of political spending, which works out to, let's say, roughly $400 million per year. But I also want to give that figure divided by the 17 million enrolled voters in Australia. It works out to political spending of about $25 per voter per year. And if we think about the major parties, it's spending of about $5 or $6 per voter per year. If you live in a marginal seat, you may find you're subject to much higher levels of spending than people in safer seats. But across the board, $5 or $6 for a major party, $25 overall. I think that's a useful corrective, because if you hear $400 million, that could be pretty demoralizing. It seems impossible to match that sum of money with collective action. But when you think about it as $25 per voter, I think it's very possible that the conversations that you have with family and friends, or the volunteering you might do, handing out leaflets or flyers or doing phone banking or so on, could actually match or exceed the amount of political advertising that's going on. It's within your power to have an influence on the same scale, voter to voter, as any party is having. And finally, I think seeing these figures can help put in perspective the kinds of influences and incentives acting on members of parliament. And I think most profoundly, to make a simple comparison, is the sums of money coming in from the fossil fuel industry. Over a 3-year period, it's worked out to about $1.8 million going in donations to the Liberal Party from the fossil fuel industry, about $1.9 million going to the Labor Party. I don't think those companies are doing that out of the goodness of their own hearts, and I think it should be a serious consideration. But that said, this sum of money cannot explain Australia's failure to properly act on climate science in the last 30 years. Because if we think back to the total sums of money involved for political parties, it becomes clear that these donations are little more than a rounding error. It's not the case that a party has to accept this money or be put at a serious disadvantage compared to its competitor. On the contrary, a party could lose this money, reject fossil fuel donations, and still be in a position that is unchanged from where they currently are, let alone the fundraising that they could do off the back of a commitment to refuse the fossil fuel industry. My neck hairs rise a little when I hear about plans to limit political donations with the aim of limiting the power of vested interests, because I don't think that it's through donations that vested interests exercise most of their power. Those of you who remember the mining tax on super profits that the Rudd Labor government tried to introduce in 2009, 2010, will remember as well that the Minerals Council and the mining industry reacted very strongly. They spent $22 million on ad campaigns criticising the mining tax and the Labor government. And they were prepared to spend up to $100 million, which, as we saw earlier, puts them at major party levels of spending. But that spending was done directly by the industry. And that direct spending far exceeded the donations that they sent to, in this case, the coalition to support its campaign. Anything that leaves this avenue of influence open, while limiting the ability of new entrants to collect political donations, I think would be kind of a perverse outcome, would fail to address the actual problem. Which brings us quite neatly to what reform should look like. About 2 years ago, the Australia Institute laid out 9 principles of fair political finance reform that we thought should guide any changes to how political parties and candidates are funded. But they break down into 2 main categories, which is that everyone should be treated fairly, voters should have a range of choices, and the law shouldn't make it harder to participate in politics. That means there shouldn't be an advantage to being the incumbent sitting MP versus being a new entrant, or an established party versus a new party. There shouldn't be an advantage to being an independent versus being a party candidate, or vice versa. And we shouldn't favour big collections of people or money over small ones, or vice versa. And similarly, changes should be targeted and effective. They should focus on the greatest threats to our democracy. We should make sure that if we're spending public money, it should be fit for purpose. It should do the things it's supposedly intended to do. And we should distinguish between good faith gifts versus the kinds of cash for access payments that are intended to influence our politics. And I'm going to take you through, using that lens, 4 main domains of political finance. 2 of them are already in place, and the Albanese government is proposing changing them, and 2 others are yet to be in place at the federal level, but they exist in state and territory jurisdictions in some form. The context here is that the Albanese government late last year presented its Electoral Reform Bill, proposing these major changes. The government had been talking about taking action throughout its entire 3-year term, but it was in the last 2 weeks of the sitting calendar, the last 2 weeks that Parliament was sitting for the year, that we actually saw what they had planned. It's about 200 pages of legislation, another 200 pages of explanatory memorandum where they go through in more detail and say what they're planning to do. And they wanted to pass it the Thursday week after they introduced it into Parliament. The changes wouldn't come into effect until 2026. We know there's a federal election this year, so the changes would be in place for the election that we expect in about 2028, which I think raises the question of why the rush. These would be the biggest changes to Australian elections since the 1980s. To put them through without a parliamentary inquiry, without further investigation, it is pretty strange. And an explanation is that with the election coming up, the major parties, Labor and Liberal, thought they were in a better position to pass these changes now than they might be after the election, with the possibility of a hung parliament, a power sharing arrangement where the crossbench might have more influence. Thankfully, those changes were delayed. They didn't get through in November, but rather than send them to an inquiry, they've been brought back. They're planned to be debated and voted on in the next fortnight. That's not a done deal, but it's the current plan. The Australian Institute's joined other integrity organisations in saying that we think there needs to be a parliamentary inquiry. And on Monday, if you keep an eye out, we've got about 44 pages of analysis, a detailed report on what we think is going to change. But it's not just the Australian Institute and integrity groups that are concerned. Our petition to call for a parliamentary inquiry into these changes has been signed by about 31,000 people, one of the most successful petitions we've ever done through the Democracy program. And I suspect many of you who signed are on the call to find out more details. So the 4 areas are donation caps, spending caps, public funding, and disclosure and transparency. I'll start with donation caps. Currently, we don't have any limits on how much a person can donate to a political party or candidate. As you saw with the mineralogy donations earlier, these can be substantial, but those are unusual in their scale. The government's proposing to restrict each donor donating to each recipient to no more than $20,000 in a given year when that money is going to be put towards electoral purposes. So you can still take more money for administrative purposes to run a political party, for example, but not to spend that on a campaign. It's worth noting here that the major parties, Labor, Liberal, Greens, Nationals, that we think of as one party are actually groups of multiple parties. each of which can receive a separate donation. To do something to limit the ability to spray money around, there's also a restriction: a donor cannot give more than $640,000 in a year to all recipients. And then I'd note also nominated entities are exempt. So what we see at the state level is that the political parties sometimes hold their assets in other organisations, or they have closely related organisations that donate to them but aren't exclusively owned by the party that they donate to. And in order to keep those assets still available to the parties, there's an exemption to the donation cap for these entities. And worth noting, for all of these changes, as I said, they won't be in place for this election, even if they pass the Parliament next week. So if we apply our two lenses of fairness and proportionality to these changes, a few things stand out. The first, in terms of fairness, is that in practice, a political party, for example, the Labor Party as a group of 9 parties, can receive 9 times as many donations from a single donor, up to the $20,000 cap, as can a party that exists as a single party. That seriously allows an amplification, a magnification of the total that can be donated. But in some ways more concerning to my mind is that because the restriction is by calendar year, a candidate who steps up in the months before an election is only eligible for a single $20,000 donation from any given donor, whereas a political party or a sitting MP that's there for the 3-year electoral cycle can receive, in fact, it's 4 donations for complicated reasons, but over 3 years, 4 donations, so a total of $80,000 from any one donor. And of course, the nominated entities exception also raises serious fairness concerns, because it would mean that no other party is able to accumulate assets over time, as have the major parties. But there's also a proportionality concern here. I don't see any reason why a donation for an electoral purpose should be any more likely to influence a political party than a donation for other purposes. I don't see the reasoning there. And I think the nominated entity exemption, while designed for the major parties and their accumulated assets, in practice might leave a loophole for a billionaire to set up a nominated entity ahead of these laws coming into effect next year, and then be ready to fund their small political party at the same tens of millions of dollars sum, as long as they get in quick before the law comes into effect. In terms of spending caps, we also have no current restrictions at the federal level. The government is proposing an $800,000 cap for each independent candidate. So a candidate runs in one of the 150 seats in our lower house, the House of Representatives. They could spend up to $800,000. There's also a cap for each political party of $800,000 in a given seat. If that advertising targets that seat, if that advertising mentions the seat or the candidate running for that seat, and divided between the other candidates that are mentioned as well. A few asterisks there that we'll come back to. That works out, or in addition, the party is also capped at $90 million across Australia. We don't really know if that in practice would limit political party spending. As you saw before, they make about $100 million a year, the major parties, but not all of that goes to federal election campaigns. And there's also a cap of $11 million for a third party, which might be the Minerals Council, a trade union, an activist group, a not-for-profit, although in practice they don't spend anywhere near that amount, and so on. And it's only capping the election spending. So you can still cover travel costs, administrative costs, and so on. I think the most pronounced fairness concern here is that those two $800,000 caps in practice operate very differently. You only need to put yourself in the shoes of a political party to think, Well, if you're limited in the spending that mentions your candidate, you can still spend millions of dollars promoting your political party, promoting your ministerial team or your shadow ministerial team, promoting your policies, promoting your party branding, and ignore that cap. And even your material that names the candidate in a seat, well, you're also running in the Senate. So name your Senate candidate at the same time, and you can spend $1.6 million in that seat naming the candidate in every single flyer, every single TV ad. That's before we get to the fact that sitting MPs already receive millions of dollars in incumbency advantages before they spend a single dollar of their own or their party's money. I think this is a serious fairness concern. And there's also proportionality and effectiveness questions here. If you cast your mind back to the mining industry campaign, they spent $22 million. They'd be capped at $11 million under these changes. But they didn't already have that money sitting around. They raised it from the corporations that are their members. And with each of those corporations also subject to an $11 million cap, I think in practice, the amount that you'd actually be restricting vested interest from campaigning is pretty limited under changes like this. So then there's a question of public funding. I've mentioned a couple of times, works out to about $3 per vote. It's a reimbursement of your actual expenditure. So if you run a lean campaign, we've seen the legalized cannabis party, for example, get votes far out of proportion with the money that they actually spend. Therefore, those votes aren't worth as much money to them because they don't have that much money to get reimbursed. They can't use a bumper year in one election to fund their next election campaign. The government's proposing increasing that public funding to $5 per vote and also introducing $90,000 administrative funding every 3-year cycle for a House of Representatives, MP, and half that amount for a senator. Now, again, our fairness lens comes in here. Because you get the public funding based on the number of votes you receive and the amount of money you've already spent, a new entrant gets no benefit from public funding until after they've finished the election campaign. And it's not possible to slowly build up spending more and more each time. You have to already have the private funding to be eligible for the reimbursement. There's also no reason I can see why a senator would have administrative costs half that of a House of Representatives MP. But in fact, the broader problem here is that the costs of administering a political party are not related to the number of members of parliament it has. If anything, it gets easier the more publicly funded resources you have. A political party with 1,000 members has to run conferences and policy development and so on, regardless of whether they have 0 MPs or 10. I think there's a case for funding political parties, but based on membership, not based on how many people they get elected. And when other jurisdictions have brought in administrative funding, at the very least, they've capped it at a certain level. There's been an acknowledgement that the costs of running a party with 30 MPs are not half that of the costs of running a party with 60 MPs. And here I've got a graph that demonstrates what I expect the changes to public funding would be. So in blue is the current public funding, and then in light blue, we have to increase it because the cost of living's increased, inflation has decreased the value of money. So we index it so that it stays the same value in real terms. Works out to about $30 million per cycle for Labor and Liberal. This is just the federal funding. They also get public funding from the states. The additional public funding and the administrative funding increases that by about half again. You can see it laid out there. It'll vary based on how many MPs a party can manage to get elected. And then we've got transparency and disclosure. This is another area where we have laws at the moment. It's over $17,000. It gets disclosed in a big data dump on Monday. There are some things that get disclosed a bit earlier, but that's the gist of it. The government's proposing changing this quite dramatically. So any contribution over $1,000 would have to be disclosed. You'd have to have real-time disclosure for gifts over $1,000 that are for an electoral purpose. So again, we're back to that distinction between spending on campaigns and spending on party admin. And they've closed the loophole that you can spray $45,000 to a party in 3 $15,000 installments and slip under the disclosure threshold. That's a nice segue to what I think of as constructive reforms that we could bring in to improve our political finance system. And the first one is transparency and disclosure. If we apply our fairness and proportionality lens to the changes that the Albanese government's proposing, I think they come out pretty well. $1,000 is not a huge sum of money. It will capture ordinary members of the public who might genuinely have a concern for their privacy. But on the other hand, $1,000 is enough to get you privileged access to a decision maker. And so it's the kinds of sums of money that we really should be finding out about. I'm not married to $1,000 as exactly the right threshold. One thing we've proposed in the past is that you could have a $0 disclosure threshold for cash for access payments. Find out about every bit of money that is changing hands to get access to decision makers. And then you could have a higher threshold, but still lower than $17,000 for bona fide donations from members of the public. But on balance, I think the transparency improvements that the Albanese government's proposed would make the system much better and are worth passing in their current form. Another change that I'd recommend is revealing lobbyist activity. All down the east coast of Australia, state governments publish ministerial diaries. They disclose who's meeting with ministers and sometimes for what reason as well. And in some places, they do that for shadow ministers as well, the government in waiting, and for chiefs of staff of ministers, because sometimes meeting with a minister's chief of staff can be more effective than meeting with the minister themselves. I don't think there's any good reason why that shouldn't happen federally as well. And while we're at it, let's say that if a lobbyist hands a minister a particular report or a bit of information, that should be disclosed by default, so it can be fact-checked by experts, and so that people, shareholders in corporations, can find out what the lobbyists for the corporations that are supposedly run in their interests are doing in the name of shareholders. It actually increase transparency and increase shareholder democracy. We've also proposed a mega donor cap, and we suggested you could set it at 2% or 1% of the total amount of public funding in the system. This mega donor cap would apply to all political contributions from a particular person. And the effect would be, it would say, no one person should be able to have an outsized effect on our democracy. That one change would cut the size of would have at the last election, have cut the size of major donations from about $200 million to about $85 million, but would only have restricted a handful of donors. That's how distorted the level of private donations is. And finally, we've suggested an improvement to the public funding system. In the city of Seattle, they use democracy vouchers. Every voter gets about $100 that they can distribute to the candidates of their choice. The great advantages here are that because the money is available before an election, a new entrant is eligible to receive it, as well as an established player. And because it's voluntary on behalf of voters, you get more buy-in. They have discretion and control over where taxpayer money goes. It also encourages more conversations with voters, going out and talking to them about their concern in the hope of, among other things, receiving their voucher. I think these changes give us a nice starting point for reform once these changes have gone to a parliamentary inquiry where they can be seriously considered. It's a complicated area, but it's one that intimately affects you as voters, and it's something you're entitled to have an opinion on. So I'm excited to hear what questions we get.
Thank you, Bill. There are indeed lots of questions, and there's been a lively conversation in the chat as well. We have a question from Jack Pezzi. Apologies if that pronunciation is incorrect. Please, can you talk about limits on political spending? The ability to spend mainly on advertising is what drives politicians to seek money, and the resulting distortion may be corruption of our politics. But I'm aware of the High Court's 1992 prevention of limits to political advertising because of an implied constitutional freedom of speech. What do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And the High Court has more recently considered caps on spending in relation to New South Wales electoral law. From memory, they've upheld caps at a certain level, but have required or have emphasised that the Constitution requires Parliament to have satisfied itself that the restrictions it's imposing are proportional. So one thing you'll see is Parliament's holding inquiries, hearing the evidence, and then legislating. And those changes are much more likely to be upheld than changes that seem to have happened as part of a political deal or have been done without consideration of the effect. I'm certainly not opposed to limits on political spending if they can be worked out in a fair way. But a few of the kind of considerations that I've raised to test our intuitions here are to think, for example, if you impose spending caps on third parties, say on trade unions and businesses and so on, is it fair that a trade union with 50,000 members be subject to the same cap as a union with 10,000 members? It's quite easy to set up corporations with a single shareholder. Does the ability to set up corporations quite trivially in practice allow uncapped donations for some causes while more established and democratic institutions are subject to those firmer caps? I think there's also a question about, if we look electorate by electorate, is it fair that all candidates are able to spend the same amount of money? I think on the face of it, it seems very obvious that that is the case. But consider yourself as a Labor member of Parliament defending your seat against a Liberal candidate and a National candidate. In practice, with per candidate spending caps, that means the coalition could outspend you 2-1. On the other hand, imagine yourself as a National defending your seat against a Liberal and a Labor candidate. You certainly wouldn't want to be splitting your spending cap between the person who's trying to displace you. I think the divisible nature of organizations, that they can represent an amalgamation of many people or none, makes it really difficult to decide on a fair cap, even though I agree that the effect is that some can seriously outspend others.
Just to let everyone know that we will put Bill's slides on the website, so you'll be able to have a look at them later if you wish. If I can have a go at putting together two questions to try and get a 2-for-1. There's a question about what reasons did Labor give for trying to change the electoral system? And I think kind of related is, since these reforms seem to disadvantage community independence, what reason might there be for wanting to do that from a Labor government?
So the Labor government's identified a few different concerns. And one of those is Clive Palmer and the sums of money that he's spent. Another is the volumes of money that we saw spent on individual seat campaigns at the last election. So there are seats, particularly the blue ribbon seats that the community independents challenged, where spending was in excess of $1 million, or I think in some cases in excess of $2 million. That comes out in part because each independent candidate has to reveal how much they spent on their campaign, whereas the party's candidate, their spending is usually aggregated with the party's overall spending. So, for example, we know that there was spending in excess of $1 million by each major party in some of the by-elections that they've contested during this term. But that doesn't show up in black and white as a figure on the Electoral Commission website, as does the spending by independent candidates. I think that's worth serious consideration, but it's worth noting as well that the way that the caps would work would still leave it open for the parties to spend millions of dollars in a seat, just not for an independent candidate to do the same. And that a sitting MP has benefited from millions of dollars in incumbency advantages, so officers, staff, communications allowance, and so on. And so displacing them, particularly if they're a minister who's also got the bully pulpit that they can use, might well be more expensive than a campaign in a safe seat or in a more conventional race. Those stand out to me as the major concerns the parties identified. Also quite often emerging is a fear of the Americanization of politics. There are examples in the US where congressmen and women, members of their parliament, spend a huge portion of their time fundraising because money plays such a major role in their elections. And there's a concern that that could happen here. I have some issues with that line of reasoning, including that we don't seem to see it happening here. And when we do see it happening here, it tends to be focused on ministers. So it's not at the level of other MPs, at least at this point. And that the US system is so different to our own, I think to change our system as a knee-jerk reaction to problems of the US system would be a mistake. You're on mute, Alice.
Thank you, Bill. There are a couple of questions about what it might look like to ban donations from anyone who's not an enrolled voter. Do you have comments on that?
Yeah, I think it raises a number of concerns. I guess the first is whether that would actually get to the heart of the issue. Particularly if some of our concern is about the ability of a billionaire to spend considerable sums of money. It's true that, to my knowledge, Clive Palmer has mostly done that through his companies, but I don't know if there's any kind of legal or accounting reason why that's happened. In practice, I think it would still be feasible for him to spend significant sums of money as an individual person on the electoral roll. I'm also not convinced that it's illegitimate for example, a trade union which has its leadership democratically elected by its members to collectively distribute some of the dues paid by those members on political causes that they think are important. And then there's a concern about, well, are you also restricting direct electoral spending by those groups? If so, then you're limiting the ability of community groups and unions and so on to run their own campaigns and ventilate issues that might be neglected by political parties and candidates. But on the other hand, if you don't restrict them, then you might still have the problem of coordinated vested interests spending vast sums of money, just not through donations. I think there's certainly a case for more transparency for corporations and organizations than for individuals, because disclosing corporate donations doesn't raise the same privacy concerns.
We have a question from Jack Ryan. Given that donations from lobbies are so low as a percentage of party income, what other explanations are available for why they're so disproportionately impactful?
I think a big part of it is the ability of those lobbies to run their own campaigns. And I think the sums of money involved in corporate operations are so vastly greater than the sums of money involved in our politics. But the ability of political decisions to affect the profitability of corporations is very profound. Whether it's management consultants losing billions of dollars of work, or gambling companies losing billions in profits as we restrict gambling advertising, or directly how much money people can lose or where they can lose it. And then the fossil fuel industry, again, a beneficiary of billions of dollars of subsidies, and should be the subject of much stricter regulation. Their ability to bring money into these direct campaigns is very substantial. There's also the ability of an industry to coordinate. If you think about a government regulation that benefits 90% of the population distributed evenly across that population, and significantly disadvantages 10% of that population, that 10% of the population is likely to coordinate far better and far more vigorously, even though the net benefit and even though the majority benefit is distributed. We see that with the ability of corporations to intensely lobby politicians, with the ability for them to commission work from, say, management consultants, that the 90% isn't able or interested in doing. Then you come to things like the revolving door, which goes both ways. So departments and ministers will be recruiting from industry and selecting people with industry connections, and industry will be hiring outgoing politicians at rates that they could never earn as a politician. I think these and many others are a part of the picture of why corporate influence is so strong.
And I think this will be our last question, if I can try and squeeze two together again. Kate Crawford asks, how can we refocus political power away from wealth and back to effective representation of electors in local communities, less of a one-size-fits-all centralized thinking? And then following on from that, Caroline Lecouteur asks, how can we best campaign against the proposed changes?
Thank you. So I think, as with everything, it's going to be multiple steps required to improve the strength of our democracy. And my go-to answer is always that political participation matters. Whether that's finding a political party or a community group or a community campaign that's aligned with your values and getting involved there, that serves to dilute the influence of other forces. The more that a party or campaign draws its strength from the grassroots, the more relative power individual people have. And of course, that extends to other ways of acting, protests, community participation, involvement in community groups, and so on. I think there's also sensible reforms that can be introduced. Truth in political advertising would help ensure that the public money that is spent on advertising goes to causes that are, or to messages that are at least factually correct. Greater transparency would give us a better sense of what's actually going on and who's funding political parties and candidates. At the moment, that amorphous category of dark money includes both the person who's collecting hundreds of $200 donations that are below the threshold, and the party that's collecting dozens of $15,000 donations, when in fact those contributions are totally unlike one another. And then I think a mega donor cap would be an elegant way of restricting the ability of the truly wealthy to profoundly distort the kind of the market of electoral advertising. In terms of what we can do, so for those who haven't signed the Australia Institute's petition, that'll be up on our website. Getting in touch with local members, both senators and your House of Representatives MP will help. There's been no announcement yet of a deal between the Labor Party and the coalition, which suggests that coalition MPs are still open to hearing the feedback from their constituents. And similarly, getting in touch with minor party and independent MPs will give them a sense of where you stand on these issues as well. You can imagine that if the Labor Party is unsuccessful in doing a deal with the coalition, attention will turn on what, if anything, could be done through the crossbench. And for them to know where you stand on these issues would be important as well. And then I think finally to kind of pay attention to these things. With a sense of the scale of political advertising, there's hopefully an opportunity to reflect on the ads that you do see, where they're coming from, what their intention might be. And if you're concerned by the advertising you see, what can you do to counteract that advertising, knowing that it probably only represents a few dollars worth of spending by a political party or by a political campaign. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Thank you. And there was a request for the petition link, so I've popped that in the chat. If you haven't already signed, please click on the link. Thank you so much, Bill, for an excellent session today. And we will make a recording of this available. And as I said, there will be the slides on the website, and there's a fact sheet if you need some of the key points to refer back to. So don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube, where you can catch all of our webinars. You can also subscribe to our podcasts, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and After America. And if you're in Canberra, then we're running our Climate Integrity Summit at Parliament House again this year. That's on the 12th of February. You can find details on our website, australiainstitute.org.au. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can email us. That's mail@australiainstitute.org.au. Please put Policy School in the subject. Thanks so much for coming along today, and we hope to see you in February for our next Policy School, which is on industrial relations reform. See you then.